It's a real pleasure to be here today, believe me, even though we are in Maryland. My wife and I moved over here a few years ago so we could experience the pain that you go through in dealing with the gun laws and regulations in this state, and it's been something of education. I remember some years ago, before Mitt Romney ran for president, he had come to an NRA annual meeting and had attended the Isla auction where we raise funds for politics, and eventually bought himself at the auction a side-by-side 20-gauge shotgun that he could use in New Hampshire, where he does most of his bird hunting, and went merrily off on his way. And then discovered, he called me, or I called him, and I said, "So, Governor, how do you like your new shotgun?" And he said, "Well, I'm not allowed to touch it. I've only been able to look at it." Turned out that there was a secret pact between Massachusetts and New Hampshire, where in order to take possession of a shotgun in New Hampshire, if you were a Massachusetts resident, you had to be in full compliance with all Massachusetts laws, which meant you had to have a gun license. And it turned out that some years before, he had acquired a gun license to buy a BB gun for his grandson, because in Massachusetts, a BB gun is almost as dangerous as a .30-06. So, but having acquired the BB gun, he had tossed the license into his drawer and forgotten about it, and now that he needed it, he couldn't find it. So he called up and asked for a duplicate and was informed that they don't issue duplicates, and that if you lose your license, you have to start over. And as he told me, so he said, "Next week I have to go for a psychological interview with the county sheriff." Oh my God. And I said, "You know, you should savor this experience because it's what we call a teaching moment. You can understand now what people go through who aren't governors, when even former governors and potential presidential candidates are thrown in to the same pool with the rest of us." And indeed, that is true. But you know, what I want to talk to you about today is not the danger that your former governor is going to be imposing these kinds of restrictions on the nation, but that somebody else might. We're in a different time today than we were just a few years ago. Remember 2012, the President of the United States, running for re-election, actually ran television ads through his campaign in various parts of the country in which the candidate, Mr. Obama, stood before the camera and said, "I will not take your gun, I will not take your pistol, I will not take your shotgun, I will not take your rifle. I'm a believer in the Second Amendment." I remember those ads, and so do a lot of other people. When we suggested that they weren't as truthful as they might be, it really hit the fan. Wayne LaPierre was called by that great pundit, Chris Matthews, was called clinically insane for suggesting that Barack Obama in any way would try to weaken Second Amendment rights, because he was obviously a supporter of America's gun rights. Was it 2 weeks ago or 3 now when the President of the United States in an interview suggested that there is a way to deal with firearms, the way that they deal with them in Britain and Australia? The word that comes to mind is confiscation. Not just registration, not just what he used to call common sense regulations. We now know what that means. The former mayor of New York always liked to declare what he wanted was simple common sense regulations on firearms ownership. We now know what that means. It means confiscation. That's what the President of the United States has always wanted, and that's what the Democratic nominee for president this year is going to want. The leading candidate suggested that one of her primary goals, if she gets to the White House, will be to reverse the Heller decision. And how do you do that? You appoint somebody to the Supreme Court who can change a 5-4 decision in favor of the Second Amendment, as the founders wrote it, to a decision finding that they didn't know what they were talking about or what they were writing, and what they really meant was that we didn't have a right and don't have a right in this country to keep and bear arms. That'll take one appointment to the Supreme Court. When the next president is sworn in, 4 members of the Supreme Court will be 78 years of age or older. And if one or two of them retires or passes on, the next president will have an opportunity to make a real mark on the meaning of the United States Constitution. And that mark, if that president is who it could be, is going to be to erase that amendment from the Constitution. But they don't even have to do that, because as a president begins to pack the lower federal courts, and as the majority in the Supreme Court begins to accept a more liberal view of how you interpret the Constitution, they can simply, as the president does, begin to describe what we would consider draconian restrictions on firearms ownership as reasonable, which is allowed under the Heller decision. Remember, every constitutional right is subject to reasonable restrictions. Free speech is free unless you do some things that are reasonably restricted. Firearms ownership is free and guaranteed by the Constitution, subject to reasonable restrictions. How you define reasonable depends upon the courts to which you appeal. The Heller decision, we were talking here at the table during lunch, the Heller decision is very clear. One of the things that the justices put into that decision might as well have been labeled the AR-15 rule. And the rule was that while Second Amendment rights are indeed subject to reasonable restrictions, one thing the government cannot do under the Constitution as we understand it is ban or restrict the ownership and sale of a firearm that's widely owned and commonly used for legal purposes. That's the AR-15, the most widely owned long arm in the United States, possessed by 4.5 to 5 million Americans. And yet, state after state is trying to ban those guns. The right judge, and some judges already said this, is, well, we don't see why that's in competition with the Heller decision. One said, we are a nation of 300 million people, and if 5 million people own a gun, that's not very widely owned. And therefore, this would be a reasonable restriction. That's up to the courts. What the courts do is, in fact, up to the president, who appoints the people to the courts, and that's why, simply that is why the 2016 election is going to be the most important election for gun owners and believers in the Second Amendment that we have ever faced. Because this time, we know what they want. This is, in a sense, going to be an honest election. There aren't going to be ads run saying, I won't take your guns. The ads are going to be, I will take your guns. That's why I'm running for president. That's what I want to do. The question is, will that work? Has this country changed so much in the course of the last decade? Have we been stampeded because of a few tragic events, even though crime and homicide and all the rest are going down, with the exception of Baltimore, which is a free fire zone? Have we changed so much that most Americans will accept this kind of restrictions on their freedom? My view is that we haven't. I was the president of the NRA through the last big gunfight with the federal government, through the Obama Bloomberg attempt to impose common sense restrictions on the Second Amendment following the Sandy Hook shootings. And after it was over, a liberal blog and blogger asked the question, why is it that when one of these things happens and there's all this outrage and then we have the fight, at the end, the polls show that more people support gun ownership afterwards than they did before? I've maintained that the reason for that is that the understanding of the true meaning and value of the Second Amendment is part of the American DNA. It always has been, and while it may weaken at sometimes, it's always there. And when people are pressed, they say, wait a minute, that's in the Constitution for a very good reason, and we ought to be cautious about doing anything that would destroy it. And that, plus the fact that the debate that takes place reveals that those who would restrict firearms ownership don't have any proposals that would do anything to impact the problems they think they're going to solve. Back during the Clinton administration, and Bill Clinton should have known better, but as he was bowing to the liberal wing of his party and deciding to go after what they called assault weapons at the time, he received a memo from Jody Powell, who had worked for Jimmy Carter in the White House, if you remember Powell's name. In fact, he owned a property here in Maryland. And Powell said, you know, Mr. President, this is a mistake. You don't understand all of these things. And gun owners will react because they know and are right about their understanding that everything you propose will do nothing about crime, nothing about mass shootings, will do nothing to solve the problems you say you want to solve. All what you're proposing will do is impact their rights, make their lives more complicated, and create a bureaucracy that they don't need, and perhaps threaten those rights in the future. And because of that, Mr. President, you shouldn't be doing this. And that memo was transmitted to the President of the United States by his assistant, George Stephanopoulos, who wrote in the margins, I agree with this. But they went ahead. And in 1994, they lost control of the House of Representatives, in large measure because they'd gone ahead. And yet they tried again in 2000. And Bill Clinton, who'd learned his lesson, said afterward that his chosen successor, Al Gore, had lost the presidency of the United States by losing 5 states because of the NRA and because of gun owner opposition. And the research that we did at the time showed that that was pretty accurate. So one of the things I've always said to people is, you know, no matter what else you might say, we saved you from 4 to 8 years of having to listen to that guy. and that ought to cover a lot of sins. So at any rate, for a while, they dropped back. And they decided that maybe this was not an issue that they needed to fight about. Then they began to forget. And so now, if you watch the Democratic debates, it's all about guns. It's a sad day when one of the great parties of the United States lines up however many of these folks they had running for president, and the only person who was tangentially a supporter of the Second Amendment was a grumpy old socialist from Vermont. The rest of them were vying with each other in suggesting ways that they could get at the Second Amendment, with the leading candidate saying she'd damn well get that decision reversed so that we would not have an individual right to keep and bear arms. So we're going to have an honest election this time, as we had in 2000, because the Democratic candidate isn't going to run those kind of ads running from his or her desire to gut the Second Amendment. She's going to get up there and say, that's what I want to do. And so the question is, what will that result in? I'll tell you what it will result in, and it's one of the reasons I'm here today. We've won those past battles, as I've said, because a belief in the value of the Second Amendment is part of the American DNA. We've won it also because so many people understand that. You know, we now have at the NRA a little over 5 million members. During our fight with the Clinton administration in the 90s, we had about 1.8 or 2 million members. Midway between then and now, the Gallup poll asked Americans whether they were members of the National Rifle Association. And that translated, when we had 4 million actual members, that translated into 40 million people saying they were NRA members. My fellow board members said there are 36 million people cheating us out of our dues. My response was that those 36 million people are why we have the influence we have. Today, and we've demonstrated this in the last election cycle, in every state that we go into to help a gun-friendly candidate, in every state, we discover that about 10% of the voters who will in fact vote on Second Amendment issues if they know they're being threatened, about 10% are formally dues-paying members of the National Rifle Association. 90% are not. But those 90%, if they get the message that this candidate or that candidate's a problem, they will go out and vote, and 50 million voters in this country makes a difference. Doesn't make a difference in a 60-40 election. It makes one heck of a difference in the kinds of elections we've had in this country in the last couple of decades. It makes the difference between winning and losing. There are senators who would not be senators today but for that issue. And this goes back a long time. Some of you here remember the old NRA. Remember when the Second Amendment wasn't an issue, when everybody agreed with it. Life members of the NRA going all the way back included the Roosevelts, Hubert Humphrey, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and the rest. Things changed in the late 60s. Up until the late 60s, the NRA wasn't really involved in politics. ILO wasn't formed until the 1970s. But in the late 60s, it appeared that the Second Amendment was going to vanish as a realistic guarantee of gun rights in this country. Lyndon Johnson, as president, forced the 1968 Gun Control Act through the Congress, and Richard Nixon's Attorney General 2 years later promulgated a plan that would have resulted in the confiscation of all sidearms by 1980. If you asked people there, and some of us were there, if you ask people, in 2015, will Americans in every state have some opportunity to get a permit to carry a sidearm concealed? You'd have been laughed at. Most people would have said that by 2015, our Olympic team is going to be training outside the country the way the British team does, because nobody's going to be allowed to own a firearm. That didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? It didn't happen because gun owners and believers in the Second Amendment, and those who knew that the Second Amendment isn't just about guns but about freedom, fought back. And the first victory was here in Maryland. You remember Joe Tidings? You know, he's not Martin O'Malley, but we do remember him. I was in the Nixon White House in those days, and at that time, the polls said in Maryland that most people were for gun control. Those were good words back then. And so Joe, bright guy that he was, said, why am I running from these few people? Why don't I just take credit for it? So he ran ads, if you were here and remember them, taking credit for being the principal sponsor of the Gun Control Act of 1968. This is what we would then call and still call a blue state, I guess. Joe Tidings was a popular senator. He was going to be reelected. That wasn't a problem. I was at the White House on Election Day. We didn't have all that stuff you have now where you can know what's going on every minute, everywhere. So somebody said, what's going on in Maryland? Somebody else said, well, let's call our guy down there. So we called into Maryland, and the guy said, I don't know what's going on, but I can tell you this. Outside Baltimore and Montgomery County, there are long lines of pickup trucks at all the polling places, and they've all got gun racks in the back window. That was a day when you still could. And Joe Tidings lost that election. He was the first politician to go down as a result of his outspoken opposition to the Second Amendment. And there have been a lot of them since then. And if we do what we need to do, if we work as hard as we need to work, if we talk to our neighbors, if we talk to others, there will be some politicians that go down next year in the same way that Joe Tidings went down, regardless of how they think they're going to do today. It's really that simple and that hard. It requires a lot of work. You know, we did it when they had the Wisconsin recall of Scott Walker some years ago. The NRA was very involved because he'd carried all of our legislation when he was in the legislature. And when he got into this fight with the unions and over the budget, he called the legislative leaders together and he said, when that budget fight is finished, the next day I want a concealed carry law on my desk I can sign. Those are the kind of politicians we like. And we went in there and we identified those 90%, and we worked and spent a lot of money to get to that 90%. And when it was over, I thought a little bit, and I said, you know, I'll bet the 10% know the 90%. Go to the same gun clubs, shoot at the same places, hunt at the same places. And if you've got that 10% mobilized, if you got the NRA membership mobilized, you're going to be able to communicate very effectively with the other 90%. And if you do that, we win the elections. In that particular race, and remember, that was a union crusade against a sitting governor. The news media was shocked that he got almost 40% of the union vote. Well, we had targeted union voters, and those who agreed with the Second Amendment, he got 78% of those votes. Because the one thing we know about people that really have a sense and a deep commitment to the values represented by the Second Amendment is that they'll cross party lines, they'll do whatever they need to do to make sure that the rights they enjoy are rights they're going to pass on to the next generation. I want to leave you with just one short story. I'll be making my second trip to Moscow next month. I was there a few years ago to speak to their gun rights organization, which is fighting to get not concealed carry, but fighting for the right for Russian citizens to own pistols. They can own long arms, but not pistols. And Russia is sort of like, any Russian town is sort of like Cicero in 1920. You know, if you get in trouble, call the police, they might come. And if they come, they might be on your side, but you don't want to take bets in advance. So there's a great popular surge wanting to be able to defend themselves and their families. But one of the reasons we went was that an honorary life member, and he has since died, of the National Rifle Association was General Kalashnikov, the inventor of the AK-47. Russia doesn't have many heroes because they had 70 years of bad times, and most of their heroes were tarnished during that period. But General Kalashnikov was a universal hero in Russia. And on the occasion of his 85th birthday, during President Putin's first incarnation as president of Russia, the government threw a banquet for him in Moscow with 1,000 or more attendees to honor him on his birthday. And President Putin made the toast, and the general stood up with his glass of champagne, looked Putin in the eye, and the general's from the Caucasus, so he's about that big, and looked up at the president and said, "Mr. President, I have a dream of a country like the United States, governed by men and women not afraid of an armed citizenry." And he sat down. We made him an honorary life member of the NRA the next day. But the reason I tell that story is, think about that for a second. People in other countries can only dream of the rights that we enjoy. And in most countries, it's an unrealistic dream. Here, we have those rights. We have them because others have fought to preserve them. And our job now is to make certain that we preserve them for the next generation. If we do that, this will be the country that we love, that we're able to pass on to our children and grandchildren. If we don't, it won't be. Thank you.